Hello, hello, friends. Thank you for tuning into the Odd Thoughts Podcast. At the Odd Thoughts Podcast, we like to talk about the everyday odd thoughts, have conversations on relatable topics, and discuss whatever comes to mind. My name is Gunther, and I am your host. Welcome to episode 50. Episode 50 is a pretty big milestone, I cannot lie. For episode 50, I wanted to talk about or start off by talking about latchkey kids. The idea behind that term, latchkey kids, is that there are kids out there that are free range kids that have little to no supervision. And I feel that as generations have kind of come on, we've kind of gotten away from those types of kids. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about main character syndrome. Main character syndrome is this idea of viewing yourself as the utmost important person, the central protagonist in your own story. And unfortunately, it comes with a lot of negative effects in the that other people will unfortunately play a side role into your story. Then I wanted to transition into talking about masking. Masking is the hiding of certain behaviors or personality traits with this fear of being judged in some way. You're kind of hiding how you actually are because you don't want to be, you don't want people to judge you. Yeah. Lastly, I wanted to end the episode on just talking about like general like podcast retrospective. Just really kind of looking back on how I feel I've done so far and all the things I've appreciated and kind of just looking on maybe the future of what I want to do with the podcast and myself in general. So, if you want to listen to any of these topics, please stay tuned in. I hope y'all enjoy as always. Before we get into episode 50, how's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing okay. It's a pretty exciting thing to have reached episode 50. I'm not gonna lie. It's a lot of episodes. I've done it over the last few months or so, and I've had a lot of fun doing it. And I just like, at first I didn't think I was gonna have enough things to talk about, and then as I kind of continued onwards, I've reached episode 50. I have 100 other episodes I can do. But that's the thing is that I've reached this point where I just want to take a little bit of a break in the sense of deciding what's next. I'd maybe want to change the podcast up or at least take some time away from it to kind of have a renewed view of it. And maybe, like I said, maybe change it. I don't know. That'd be kind of fun. But maybe there is other content outside of podcasting that'll enjoy as well. I've been really into this, I've talked about it all the time where, I'm trying to work on art and I'm trying to work on writing and stuff like that. And that stuff has taken a really big stronghold in my life. And in my mind, I view myself as maybe having a possibility of writing more so than anything. So with the podcasting, it's like I have things lined up and I do have episodes lined up, but maybe I can take a little time to continually get that stuff ready while working on my writing and working on my art. I want to get better at honing in on like specific things, specific stories and specific, subjects to draw and make art of. I'm just too sporadic at times and I'm just constantly I feel like there's always the idea this podcast always sits in the back of my head and it's not like I don't enjoy doing it, but it's kind of become this thing where I feel like I'm forcing myself a little bit and I'm just not like every day I think that I should do a podcast or I should do a little bit more and kind of leading up to the last couple weeks that I've kind of decided that I'll take a break at 50, like a month really, like it's I'm starting to free up a little bit more mind. I had a really good productive day with art yesterday and today after I'm gonna edit the podcast, upload a podcast, but I'm probably gonna write a little bit. And I've been doing poetry, not very good, but there's just other things I crave on doing outside the podcast, and I don't want to hold my hat on the podcast and be known as a podcaster. It was always just something to give me confidence. It put myself out there. Da, 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 da. But I would like to make my name known for something else, and if not, I just want to feel good that I've like tried to feed into as much creativity as possible and come to maybe that consensus that if it doesn't happen now, it'll happen eventually. I just want to be okay with that. Whatever though. Episode 50 though. I'm so happy that we're here and I appreciate everybody that is listened to, and whether you listen to every single topic on every single episode or you like to pop into just a couple random topics here and there, I don't care. That's the whole point. Hopefully you find something that you want to listen to and you listen to it. Without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into episode 50. As each generation of people come along, it seems like there is a unique kind of way that every generation lives. Specifically, I think kind of in how each generation kind of grows up. I was looking around, like doing some research on random topics, and came across a term that I've heard before, but I guess I just never really thought about. I came across a term called latchkey kids. For anybody who doesn't know what a latchkey is, it's just literally like one of those like slide locks. You know what I'm saying? Like at like on doors or like I always think of like kind of hotels or whatever. But when you describe someone as or a generation of kids or a kid as a latchkey kid, usually you mean they're kind of a free range child in some way. They're someone who is kind of left with very minimal to no supervision. I was reading like kind of what the definition is, and it's kind of just like children who return to empty homes after school or type thing, or they spend their time outside of adult supervision, yada yada. But that's something that you've kind of it's a big discussion point. It feels like it feels like when we talk about like different generations. I'm a like a very like at the end of millennial, beginning of Gen Z. I was born in '96, so sometimes considered a very late millennial, sometimes a very early Gen Z. But I kind of consider myself growing up in kind of a millennial sense. It feels like I wasn't very reliant on like technology and stuff like that. And as the generations, as we kind of have come into like Gen Z and in further on, like Generation Alpha or whatever, it feels like it's changed. Kids have kind of changed. And then when I think about like older stuff, when I hear about like stories of like my dad or like my grandparents growing up, just kind of crazy to think about how different kids, similar in some ways, but different in a lot of ways. When it comes to like latchkey kids, the term latchkey kid, I think it was popularized kind of around the World War II kind of era. There was like a heavy amount of fathers who were enlisted, and all of a sudden, a lot of moms were forced to get jobs. So it was kind of like, unfortunately, kids were left to be on their own. But also, it probably is an argument for at that time, maybe kids were a little more like in tune with things, like, kids could like maybe make themselves, a meal or, they could distract themselves for a few hours. That's something I've kind of remember as a kid is like when I'd be left at home alone, I just could like, it's like sometimes you wouldn't even notice. It's like, your parents would be like, I'll be right back. And you're like, okay, whatever. And then like a couple hours later or something like that, they're back or whatever, or a few hours later. It usually wasn't a whole lot. It's like, I kind of remember more so like during the summertime, like, my parents had to work, there wasn't a whole lot of, time for them not to work. So, you'd be home for like a few hours. You'd be home for like 8 hours. And, you learn to make like, you learn to do things for yourself. And, very much so like I'm blessed to be in an era of like technology and I didn't have like we didn't have a computer growing up. Like I didn't have a computer until I moved in with my grandparents and like I didn't have like smartphones obviously weren't a thing. So, it was but video games were very much so a thing and like DVDs and TV, then I think about like, when my grandparents were growing up, they grew up out in like farm, in the farmlands. Like they didn't have TV. They had like radio. Eventually they would get TV, but it's like they didn't have that stuff. It was like when they were outside, they were always doing something and sometimes like forced to do chores. And I was never forced to do chores, but I remember doing things like, taking out trash or obviously cleaning up messes I make. But I think, I was reading that kind of the latchkey kid really it became more commonplace. It was popularized around like that, or it became more of a familiar thing around that time, but it became more commonplace in like the 70s and 80s. Specifically, it was kind of being used to describe like Generation X, which is kind of like my mom's generation. my dad's kind of like he's like he's born in the early 60s, so it's like baby boomer basically. But my mom is like the 70s. So she's more of that Generation X, and they're described as kind of like apparently they've been like the most they're like the least parented and least nurtured generation as for I don't know how you measure that in metric, but it kind of seemed like that was a commonplace thing. And it was really more prevalent because of higher divorce rates, which is one thing. And then also like a lot of women going into the workplace, which is just how things happen. It's just what like our world became. And that's okay because I think at that time, right, it's the kids were still kind of, reliable on their own. It's kind of like they could be easily distracted for a few hours and you never really thought about it. And especially like if your kid goes to school for 6 hours and you might work 8 hours, they kind of come home on the bus and they're only going to be home for a couple hours by themselves. So you could trust it, I think. And like, I think about my mom and my dad, and they're trustworthy people. They can hang, you know what I'm saying? And they were kind of those kind of kids too. They weren't really high maintenance kids. They weren't at all. They were very low maintenance kids. That's kind of that's when I think the latchkey kid term really happened. And when we think about like you want your kid to have some sort of independence, right? You want your kid to be able to like do things on their own and take control of things and they're only gonna they have to learn, obviously. You gotta be able to teach certain things, but eventually concepts come into like, what am I trying you understand concepts when you get a little older. And I think like between the ages of 5 and 13 is when is like specifically what latchkey is referring to because it's kind of still that kid era. When you become a teenager, it kind of feels like that's really like your mind can comprehend that kind of independence and that kind of stuff. Some people maybe not as much as others, but it felt like when I became a teenager, I kind of understood like, being on my own and doing stuff on my own and like I mean like I was, I started doing my own laundry when I was like 11 or 12, you know what I'm saying? And learning how to like fix yourself a sandwich earlier than that or like it's like, I feel very like I said, I feel very lucky maybe just coming from parents who are very like they don't want their kids to be relying on everything and yeah, I'm blessed to have those parents. My parents were very much so like they're the type of parents that let me, it's run into the wall to find out it's hard, right? You touch the fire to find out it's hot type thing. It's like and they let me do things and sometimes like, I was embarrassing and I looked a little stupid and I got hurt from things, but they let me be a kid. They let me discover things and kind of like I don't know if I would consider myself like a latchkey kid. I very much I had parents around, but like I said, like with work, it was kind of hard. And, my dad made sure to like, he would like do things like, you know, um, he would drop us off early at like my grandparents. And so he can go into work really early. And we would hang out at my grandparents for a couple hours before eventually going to school so that my dad can get 8 hours in. And by the time he's done with his shift, it'll be like right at the time that me and my little sister would get off school. And, we might do like some of those after the bell programs and you might have to sit outside front of the school for a few minutes, but it was always like he made an effort to do that kind of thing. But like I said, unlike things like, like if he had to work a weekend or if he had to work while vacation time, like while me and Katie, my little sister, were on like vacation, he would, it would, we were left home. It was like, we were just left home. And I think he like trusted that, two kids may be better than one because you're not as lonely and you're not as like bored. And, me and her can always kind of feed off each other. And like we can protect each other. Like if one person wasn't really paying attention for something, the other one was type thing. That's kind of like that's how I describe me and my little sister. Like kind of always subconsciously looking out for each other. But undoubtedly, there probably are some negative effects when it comes to this latchkey kid type of parenting, or when you have like a latchkey kid. There can be some negative effects, there could be some positive effects, but when it comes to that kind of negativeness, with obviously that lack of adult attention, that can lead to some behavioral problems or like a want to act out in a certain way because there's no sort of some sort of guidance, regular guidance or when there is a hand to kind of push along the kid or like some of authoritative force, it might come in these like random spurts. And the kid doesn't have that connection with the parent. It feels like that they're only being like, talked down to and stuff like that. But also things like, loneliness and boredom and fear. Like It can be scary, especially with like a stranger danger sense. Like my dad grew up in like a small town, grew up in like a farm town, and he grew up to next to some train tracks. And he used to talk about like, like vagrants or like homeless people on the trains, and like you don't go there at a certain time of night. And he very much so was like that way with me, my mom too. They were very much so like, you better be home by before dark. And they never threatened me with like grounding me. It was always like, you're gonna get kidnapped and murdered if you don't get home by 7 type thing. Yeah, whatever. But it's very much so like being by yourself can also like lead to maybe higher rates of depression and lower self-esteem. Being by yourself as an adult, you kind of realize a little more that it's not always good for your health, right? It's not always good for your psyche. It makes you feel, it makes you feel weird. It makes you feel, down on yourself, and it feeds into those negative feelings. It's hard to say that it's always a negative experience, maybe for some kids, but for some it cannot, it may not be. The whole hope that if you leave your kid alone, they might gain some sort of independence. And if you lead them into certain scenarios and you try to tell them, like, well, this is how you do this. Whenever I'm not around, you can do this. And even when you're around, like as a parent, when you're around your kids and they can still do things on their own, that might be able to tell you that they have that ability of independence, right? If there's enough things that are distracting the kid, or enough things going on at home, or like if they able to drop them off somewhere, then it feels like that they don't notice that the adult's not around necessarily, and that can be, and it kind of adverts the negative effects a little bit. But that's all. I think that's from kid to kid. I think if, like, yeah, if you leave a kid home and they ain't got nothing to do, they're just gonna stew into nothingness, and that's when the loneliness and fear and boredom sits in. But for me, I was very lucky to have a younger sibling who was only 2 years younger than me, and I had video games, and I had like I was very. There's always a joke amongst my family that like you could stick me in like a corner of a room with a block and like, a Hot Wheel, and I'll be, when I was little, and like I'd be fine for hours. It's very much so the same thing. It's like you leave me with something, you know what I'm saying? And I'm good. But it's so funny just think like I have a niece and nephew now, and I don't think I would trust them to be home alone as I was with my little sister. They're very much so. It's like the whole thing with kids nowadays is they're tuned into electronics. They don't know, like they don't have enough. It's like, or like they don't have enough. What am I trying to say? Like they don't want to know what's out in front of them. Maybe they get so much from the tablets and watching YouTube and da 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 and da 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 that it's like they don't need to look up. It's like why? What's the point of looking up and learning about the world? But there's so much about the world that as a kid I was so lucky to have learned and take into concept, you know what I'm saying? And I don't it's I trust my niece and nephew very much. I think they're smart kids, and they can be those kids to be left alone. They can be, right? But I think it's just a general sense of the generation, and maybe like, you know, some of the bad experiences that like, I had, or like my older sister had, or something like that, like that you kind of become a little more tepid when you're having kids of your own. You don't want them to be hurt in the same way you were, and you don't want them to get into the same troubles. And maybe because of the way you kind of started to develop your own mind, you think that things are going on. And my older sister's not a paranoid person like that. She's very much so like she lets her kids be kids. That's the beautiful thing, is she holds on to that. Like how we grew up, it was different. Like you just, that's just funny. I love my niece and nephew very much, and I love, I just love, I have faith in kids nowadays. It's not like they can't be independent or whatever. And you never know, like the whole latchkey kid thing might turn around, and you see like maybe some of the mistakes that certain parents have made, and it becomes like a trend to do maybe the opposite. Or you kind of just shove a tablet in your kid's face and tell them to shut up, and then it becomes a problem. So what do you do to 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 opposite that problem, to fix that problem? You push them outside, take away the tablet and make them think. Whatever, though. I think the term's not dead, right? The latchkey kid is a term that's still very much so in the zeitgeist, and I feel very lucky to have grown up in that kind of generation where technology wasn't super popular, and kids weren't super dependent on that thing, but also kind of stuck in that in between of like, well, my parents learned from what they did, and my older sister learned from what they did, and so it, you kind of, the leash is long enough, but it's short. And it just feels like right now it's short on kids. And maybe it's from a paranoid parents. Maybe it is from a certain sign that the kids are giving off. But, latchkey kids are those free range kids. We all have known those kids. Maybe we were those kids, but it's okay to be a latchkey kid and grow independence as a kid. There are some people in this world that have a very heightened sense of self to a certain point to where it becomes a very egotistical thing. And they consider themselves the kind of described as like a main character, right? Over the last couple years, there seems to be this kind of like popularized term in some ways, and kind of a popularized concept called a main character syndrome. It's kind of this idea that there's someone who thinks of themselves as above everybody else. They're the main characters in their stories, and everybody else is involved in their story as a side plot, a side character. It's mostly associated with something of like trying to encourage someone to be like, "Oh, I'm the main character, right? I'm the main character of my story. I need to, be the person I want to be, and write my own thing, and da da da, screw what everybody else does." But unfortunately, it feels there it can be a certain negative effect with that main character syndrome. Just beyond the defining of the main character syndrome is, you're perceiving yourself as the central protagonist in your own lives, right? You are the most important thing in your own life. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to think about. You should worry about yourself mostly, but it becomes this kind of thing where it becomes like an exaggerated focus on self sense of importance and entitlement. Sorry. You kind of start to think that you're more important and you're entitled to certain things because of how important you are. And if you shift into that negative side of the main character syndrome or whatever, it becomes more narcissistic and definitely 100% self centered. I think, there's a certain belief like exceptionalism in a way, right? You believe that you are better than everybody else and nothing really matters and everything you do is only congruent to you. And even if it does have an effect on someone else or, a negative effect in some sort of sense, it doesn't matter because it's just you. That is a very, I can't say that being thinking of yourself as the main character is always bad. Like I said, you want to kind of control your narrative and control your life story. And, you're going to have to unfortunately let things out of your control and let things develop naturally. But it's okay to think of yourself as a main character, the protagonist in your story. But like I said, when it gets to those extremes of like, you start to think like you're more important than other people or you're more entitled than other people. And kind of ignoring like a sense that other people have their own stories going on too, that's when it becomes the problem. That's when that narcissisticness of main character syndrome really comes through. There are certain, psychological factors that kind of go into MCS, as I abbreviated in my notes. There's a certain like conscious bias or self-serving bias that people usually have. You only believe things that fit your narrative type thing. You're always going to believe that something's going to be the way it is because it fits into who you are or how you think you are, more so. Obviously, with that inflated self perception, you're kind of going to believe you're a little bit better than you are and a little bit more than you are. I was reading something that it could be used also in a possible coping mechanism way, right? Maybe that this heightened sense of self is a way to kind of escape from reality of life, to, you know, to have control where there is no control sometimes, and perceive exceptional qualities. Like I said, in a way of like escaping the actual reality of like your life. Not saying that people aren't necessarily warranted for exceptionalism or can work towards exceptionalism, but it's an unwarranted view of exceptionalism, right? It's that exaggerated life narrative. You're boosting your self-worth and you're trying to solidify a sense of identity without actually like working for a self identity, a sense of self identity. You know what I'm saying? It's one of those things where you're gonna make up stories and make yourself seem, you know, smarter or cooler or more inept so that it fits what you want to be known as. That's a very big thing. It doesn't hurt to try to think of yourself in a better sense, and it doesn't hurt to try to think of yourself as having good qualities, right? But when it's a running away thing and not a running towards thing, just doesn't help. When you're trying to escape the actual reality of yourself and you're just playing yourself up, then it's only going to be a constant letdown when you're not actually like working towards that perception. But if you earn that way and you kind of like, fix your life narrative and actually work in the problems and stuff like that, that actually solidifies a true sense of self. There are tons of societal influences. Very much so, I think, like when you're watching a TV show, any sort of entertainment in that way, it's always going to be a thing where the protagonist is going to be seen as extraordinary. You're never going to see a book or read a book or watch a TV show or watch a movie where the protagonist is lame. That's not going to happen, right? So there's always going to be an inflated sense, right? And you want to be that person, and especially like enjoy watching that character, and you'll want to be that character, right? And then somehow subconsciously ignore that it's a written person and they're inflated to make them seem like more of a protagonist that fits the story they're trying to tell or whatever. Very much so, social media is something that like this offers a way to kind of give an idolized version of yourself, right? You can spiel a certain narrative. You only show the highlights of your life, and you can tell the good things and hide all the bad. And that kind of gives you this sense of like, well, then I always got to be good, or I must be good because people like it when I show this stuff, so I must be always good. It's kind of a piss poor thing. And then sometimes in the way of like idolizing celebrities on social media or idolizing people on social media in general, I think there's a general side kind of seeking a validation and tension that, you know, it doesn't hurt to post on social media. I think it's a way to give confidence and show off maybe an outfit you felt kind of good in and stuff like that or whatever, or just show like the bits of your life that you think are interesting and maybe other people will want to see. But if it's for that validation, the strictly seeking of a validation and attention, then it's just going to be an eventual letdown. It doesn't really help you at all. There's a it's it can it very much so this kind of this negativeness of this main character syndrome definitely has certain impacts on your personal development, right? That can there maybe is a certain resistance to change, right? You kind of have settled into a certain perception of self that you don't care how you really are, you don't care how you actually act. And so when people tell you that you're not okay or these things are not okay or it becomes some sort of inflicting force, there could be a lot of resistance, right? A lot of resistance because also there is that fear of kind of coming outside that comfort zone, that little bubble you've all of a sudden built, right? It just all adds up to that kind of reluctance of seeking growth. You kind of already seen yourself as like you're already okay. I'm already up here. I'm already exceptional, so I have no need for growth. Why would I change? I'm already here. But there maybe is something in the back of your head where you're like, well, I'm lying to myself type thing. So that's where that fear comes in. you know, any sort of setbacks that happen to you eventually become like you're just kind of blaming these setbacks. You're not actually sitting there and saying like, oh, this happened because did something wrong or because of the behaviors I was using. You just won't decide to learn from any of that. And there becomes a certain over reliance, right, on that kind of external validation. You're not okay with yourself, so you're constantly shaping yourself just to be validated by whoever. It doesn't matter if they matter to you, right? And it's very much so those things where you're using people in the sense of like validation, and you're not actually trying to cooperate with others. You're not trying to like compromise, and you're not trying to actually get along with anybody. You're just hoping they feed into your your sense of your delusional sense. You don't care how you affect others, and you don't care to how they affect you necessarily, only in the sense of having attention and feeding into who you are type thing, right? Yeah, it's just like, you know, I don't know, like I kind of, there's a inability sometimes to contribute to much more outside of yourself when you're just thinking about who you are and how things affect you. you have no contribution to outside other things. You disregard other people's perspectives and you disregard other people in general. So you have nothing to give to really anybody. You don't care to listen. You're a poor listener. You may even escalate conflict in a way, right? You may just think that like it's a personal attack on you anytime anybody comes towards you or they don't feed into your validation, then you're going to feel like it's an attack or something like that. And then you don't have that conflict resolution with that main character syndrome. You don't know what it means to actually like compromise, right? It's such a weird thing. Like, there's it's a total you just think of yourself as more important. So there's no common ground, there's a lack of insight. You fail to recognize how you're impacting people and even when people tell you you have that zero accountability, it's that main character syndrome. It's that who cares the everything outside the story. My story is more important than other people type thing. It's closed minded. It is, and it can 100% impact like your personal relationships. In various ways. You're treating everybody like they're playing a supporting role, right? And so you immediately make their desires and their needs lessened. You immediately think that everything that you're doing is absolutely important and everything else is not, right? You don't have the ability to empathize, right? You don't know, you don't understand what they're going through, and you kind of have forced maybe some standards or first force a certain perception on that person, and it disappoints you when they're not that way, when they act outside of your, what you thought was going to happen, and you just don't appreciate others, right? You don't appreciate but others' experiences, and maybe someone can give you an insight on how acting this way can be terrible, but you ain't want to listen to that, right? It's maybe like I mean, I think we all can kind of recognize that main character syndrome. We all kind of know people who think of themselves as like super important, right? People who have kind of like, that pattern of thinking in the way of, excessive self focus and self importance, these unrealistic expectations of what their life should be. And when you have this heightened expectations and you think you deserve all these things, then there's that difficulty of accepting failure or criticism in any way. That's immediately the consistent pattern of thinking that it feels like everybody who has this kind of negativeness of main character syndrome, it's all this kind of similarness. Sorry, I'm kind of getting backwards. I'm trying to read ahead. Sorry. There are certain, maybe even like emotional and behavioral indicators, right? Very much so. There's a lack of empathy or like emotional intelligence. You just don't, when other people are trying to share themselves and their feelings, you just don't care. And you don't want to say that, you didn't want to blame them for their unexceptionalness or whatever, right? You could be also a pretty manipulative person. Everything you do is just for your self-centered behaviors, just to appease your self-centeredness. And unfortunately, that leads into difficulty, sorry, I keep having like hiccups. That leads to a difficulty of maintaining relationships in general. You're disregarding everybody's feelings and you don't understand them. You don't choose to understand them. You lack that kind of emotional regulation in your own sense, emotional intelligence and recognizing others. And it's just like obviously it's just going to lead to nobody wanting to be around you. And the whole thing of like, assessing your own personal narrative. That's the whole thing is like, there's a constant, infatuation, obsession more so when people have the extremities of MCS, main character syndrome. They are always trying to, exaggerate their own narrative, right? Make it seem super important, right? And one of the things is like self-reflection allows insight, and a lot of that insight comes from external perceptions, like things from the outside in. And if you're kind of just set into your own narrative and you're not really trying to better it naturally or let things actually better it for you, then it just becomes, I don't know, like, what am I trying to say? It just becomes a different, you're constantly just assessing your own personal narrative. That's really all I'm trying to say on that. I was a little bit of jumbles. Like I said, I was confusing myself by reading ahead, you know, but there's probably in most things, not in all things, but in most things, with something like this, you want to overcome the extremes of main character syndrome, right? It's okay to view yourself as a main character in your story, but when we describe it as like that main character syndrome, It's kind of seems it's really trying to say that it's pushed past a normal point in like a way. It's gone to the extremities of like self-importance and self-perception to the point where you're pushing everybody else's like lives out of your own and thinking that they're not as important as yours is. Sorry. But I think there is a way to overcome and seek help for main character syndrome, getting over that kind of thinking. You have to practice a certain mindfulness, very much so. You have to kind of have like a certain awareness, recognizing, how you act, when you're talking to other people, when you're thinking about how you should be rather than actually what you're capable of being. You have to be very mindful of that kind of stuff and recognize limitations, recognize strengths too. Don't have a certain inflated, perception of self when you don't have those abilities, right? Then, and also don't limit yourself if you know that you can handle things. It doesn't hurt to limit yourself, control what you can't control 100%. You have to work on a certain emotional regulation as well, right? You have to embrace a certain kind of a vulnerability and humility. You got to learn that, people feel things and you have to feel things to learn, right? You can't just like think that like everything should be good and I deserve all this, right? It's just going to lead to, I think, more anger than anything else. And you're just going to be angry when everything is let down and you just start blaming everything else. You blame every single external factor. So you got to embrace a certain vulnerability and humility, embrace that ability to take on problems and realize that maybe you messed up and you have to like right that wrong. Yada yada. Generally, healthier relationships with people. That's kind of the whole thing is like practicing empathy and understanding others. You just want to grow connections and I think like when you're growing connections, it kind of adds a certain like it. I don't know, you try to grow genuine connections more so. That's what I was trying to say. I'm like talking backwards. But with like that healthier relationship patterns and actually trying to understand others through things like, literally like active listening, literally be an active listener. Listen to people's experiences, understand that people go through things, and that helps with like genuine compassion for others. I think it's one of those things where like, you want to be able to have an independence, right? But you want to have connections with others because I think that makes you feel human. There's a certain balance between individuality and in like an interdependence in a way. It's like the whole thing is like you want to make sure that you're totally in control of your own personal autonomy and you want to make sure that you're cooperating with yourself and you're not inflating things to believe what you want to believe or what you think you want and like what you think you deserve may not always be realistic, right? So you got to work on how you control those things and how you enact actions to solve problems and stuff. The whole idea is that you lead to a certain personal growth. That's like, we're always kind of working on that kind of thing, right? We're always working on ourselves. And when you start to feel a little bit better about yourself and you're able to self-reflect healthily, you don't have to feel like you're the main character, and that main character syndrome kind of starts to fade in some senses, right? As long as you're setting like, you're setting realistic goals and expectations, right? You're realizing that, not everything is done overnight, and you embrace the challenges that kind of come with you with the things that you want and the goals that you set. That there's only going to be a self improvement. That's the whole idea, and hopefully a little bit of gratitude too as well. You will constantly want to try to examine your personal motives too. Like, is it because you want to be better than everybody else, or is it because you think you deserve everything great, or is it because it's just going to help you? It's going to help you be a little bit better as a person, and it's just it's because it's the sense of living or whatever. We all have, I think, that desire for significance, right? We all want something in our lives to feel significant about, or feel significant in our own lives, right? We all kind of explore, that need for control. And, I think a big thing is like you uncover a lot of insecurities about yourself and you need to be able to handle that and not have that, like, not feel like, why would I feel this way? I'm this, and this. I'm so great, da da da, yada yada. That's the whole thing. I think kind of with like main character syndrome, it kind of gets thrown around and it's more so like a playful thing. Like I said, I think I sometimes hear it more in the sense of, you want to be the main character in your own story, right? And but it does get used when you see someone who's acting like a total jerk and they don't care how they affect others and everything that, they have a certain inflated and heightened sense of self to where they think they deserve everything. I think we've all seen that, and we've seen certain like exaggerated versions of that in shows and TV. That's a real thing. And if you're someone who suffers from that kind of, it doesn't hurt to think of yourself as important, but a certain over heightened sense of importance, and you are negating everybody else's experiences and wants and needs for your own, then you are probably suffering from that main character syndrome. For most people, there is a lot that is going on in their heads. Not everybody can handle certain mental health issues and certain things about their minds that make them feel negative about themselves. And unfortunately in the world, we are all kind of cursed with that kind of struggle at times. We may think of ourselves as, a certain way, and we may think that we're not good enough for something. And when we talk to other people and we interact with other people, we may sometimes have a perception that we are just less put together than everybody else. And that can bring on a lot of insecurity in who you are and how you act and how you behave and stuff like that. Even when you can't help it sometimes, like, you'll want to try to hide those things. And when you're interacting with people, which inevitably we will all have to do, you may have a tendency to mask who you are. There is a concept of masking, which is the idea of kind of hiding or suppressing certain behaviors or certain difficulties that you have with your mental health. It's kind of like a coping mechanism due to certain social pressures or, maybe a fear of certain harassment or something like that. It can sometimes be it can be conscious, but usually it's kind of it's unconscious concealing of true thoughts and feelings. In a way, you're kind of having this sort of compensatory behavior, right? You kind of have a certain perception of how you behave, and makes you scared that you're going to let it out on someone else. And it gets you a little bit fearful that someone's going to react a certain way. So you hide it and suppress how you feel actually. And in times, it maybe can help for that short term. Maybe you're just only interacting with someone for a short moment, but inevitably with certain people that you kind of know, and in general, when you're walking through life, masking can only last for so long. You're only hiding your problems, you're not solving your problems, you're turning a blind eye to them more so. There are certain signs of masking that you can see, right? With social masking, you're more so mirroring someone to cover up that kind of uncomfortableness. I've talked about mirroring in my past episodes, and that's the unconscious mimicking of people's behaviors, just so that you don't have to, relinquish your own. Sometimes more mirroring can be used to kind of, just make it feel like a more comfortable exchange, but it can inevitably be a way to, mask who you truly are. There is also like that behavioral masking, right? You might hide the little, stimming behaviors and fidgeting and the certain little quirks that you have. You can't help but feel those things, but when you're consciously hiding it, you're gonna it becomes uncomfortable. It's that behavioral masking. There's a certain compensation I think that sometimes people have, when it comes to that masking. They like um what am I trying to say? More energy and time given to compensate for struggle. I don't know what I was saying with that. Sorry. So I confused myself with my notes. I'm sorry. But usually there's a certain inconsistency with emotions. It's like the emotions is incongruent compared to the circumstance more so. And you will inevitably act maybe different in private than you do in public, right? That's the whole thing, is that your private behaviors, how you act by yourself, will change once you're out in public through some sort of like, some sort of conscious like belief in masking yourself. I was trying to think of something better to say, but I couldn't think. I'm sorry. I'm just lost in myself. Sorry. You know, expression and behaviors change between alone time and when you're around others. Very much so, right? And if you isolate yourself and you withdraw yourself from people, you're really only dealing with struggles all alone, right? You distance yourself to avoid sharing true feelings. And like I said, that only works for a short amount of time. Isolation doesn't happen, it's not forever. And eventually you are going to have to interact with others through different circumstances, right? But, if you're just fighting constantly how you act and how you behave, it's only going to hurt you in the long run. There's certain maybe like, with certain sudden behavioral changes, like that's something a way that you can kind of notice a masking. There's a notable, so like if you know someone to be this way and all of a sudden they're out in public, you see that quick shift in their personality and in yourself. Like if you can notice that, if you notice that you're a masker, you might notice that kind of like sudden change in who you are. You're kind of a this goofy person alone, but then on public, maybe you kind of suppress that goofiness, or you're maybe kind of an angry person on your own, or sometimes you can be a little too angry. And then out in public, you're just like, you just try to disconnect from everybody or whatever. There's certain things like when it comes to like like when it comes to recognizing masking, you can see it sometimes in people's like body language or their facial expressions. They might be kind of like, forcing a certain uncomfortable position toward like standing position facing someone, and they might try to force a certain facial expression to hide the struggles, and maybe like in a way like make like eye contact, forcefully make eye contact to try to seem like they're engaged in something and avoid kind of like letting on that there's something in their head that's going on, that they're concurrently trying to suppress something. Makes you wonder why people mask. I think we all feel like uncomfortable in some certain situations and around certain people, and who knows? And some days may be better than others, right? That's a whole thing too. People unfortunately mask. They have that masking, sensibility. I think it's one of those things where you're behaving unnaturally, right? And you're doing it because you're trying to protect yourself from perceived backlash or something like that. You think that because of how you behave and how, your little intricacies, that someone's going to like negatively respond to that. And we all want to be accepted by others to a certain point, 100%. So that unnatural behavior is that way of trying to be accepted. And like I said, that fear of a stigma or kind of like, discrimination in a way, right? You might think that you're weird and that like you've got too much going on. And then if you let off the slightest little hint, then that people are going to kind of like marginalize you and bully you for it, and, just set you off to the side and make you seem like, they're pointing and laughing at you type thing. That's not always the case. I think most people have that understanding that we're all kind of going through things, and even in the sense that you might be trying to do it, or you're trying to mask in front of a certain person or a certain group of people, maybe they're masking as well, right? And you sometimes maybe have certain expectations of how you're going to behave, and then all of a sudden you might have that fear of unmet expectations. You want to behave a certain way and you want to be a certain way, feel a certain way, but when you don't have those, when those expectations are met, it can be very scary for you and can make you feel very uncomfortable. And maybe like you don't have a willingness to conform with like social expectations, and or like the ability to kind of conform with social expectations. So that's a big thing too. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting with the masking is coping with sensory overload. I'm someone that very much so struggles with like sensory issues, very much so. So like I understand like, kind of closing off a little bit or acting a certain way just because of how overwhelmed you are, right? I that's a big thing. And also like, I don't know. It's you want to like you have a desire for like a personal success or telling yourself truly, you want to show yourself truly. And so it's a pressure when you don't excel at that. And when it's a difficulty maybe truly showing your emotions and who you are, your personality, that could be there's a lot of pressure behind that, 100%. And it kind of like holds on from that desire to be truly known in a way. I think it's like one of those things where sometimes it can be a very unconscious thing to mask, 100%. But there are certain conditions I think that are kind of associated with masking, or you mask because maybe you suffer from like depression or certain anxiety disorders or something like that. Certain like stress disorders, traumatic, PTSD, something like that. Substance abuse, you know, if you're someone who struggles with these certain kind of like social disorders, even, you might kind of like mask because it's just too much going on in your head and you already kind of have this feeling taking over. You know it's going to let out. It affects who you are and how you act. You're going to try to do your best to mask that. And there is 100% a certain, you know, impact of masking. There may be certain increased emotional distress, right? And there's a buildup of unresolved feelings. If you're constantly putting off on how you actually feel and how you actually are, then it's only going to build up, right? It builds up those unresolved feelings, yada yada, like I just said. There is a certain difficulty, I think, when it like seeking help in general, right? In general, like it's hard to like get help with mental health, and you don't want to like let people know that you're struggling through those fears of discrimination or marginalization and things like that. I think we all kind of have that fear of being judged a little bit. And so that leads to social isolation. That leads to us hiding our true selves, and challenges the genuineness of who we are and the genuineness of the relationships we have. It just generally leads to like a poor self-acceptance because you feel like you need a mask and you feel like you can't accept yourself. You feel like that nobody will accept yourself, right? Accept who you are. And it's a big thing is like you'll start to diminish maybe certain self struggles that you have, and you'll just be exhausted, and you maybe worsen certain mental health conditions through that constant masking. So, if you're someone who masks, we want to eventually, like I am, I can't admit that. I can admit that. I try not to be, but I do because I don't want people to know that I'm crazy. No, but you want to take the mask off, right? So we want to unmask. You want to recognize the behaviors that you're doing that are unnatural to you. You want to recognize that you're kind of hiding these certain natural behaviors, these certain traits of your personality, and hopefully you increase in some way comfortability with like others, and yourself, I guess more so. You want to be able to feel comfortable with all the things that you do and who you are, right? And make sure you find like a setting that is suitable for you. Find safe spaces, find people who offer that safe space to you. You got to learn how to just behave your natural self and embrace the uncomfortability at first, And I think there's so many different ways you maybe can try to socialize with people and, stim and like, what I'm saying, stimming behaviors, things that kind of distract you for a second while you're out in public and out while you're around other people. But that's the whole thing is the only way to get over that masking behavior is to be comfortable with the unmasked version of yourself, right? You just got to be okay with all the little, in the whims that you have, all the little behaviors and, personality traits that you have. And everybody has a little bit of a fear of being judged. Some people not as much as others. And, you want to feel confident in yourself, right? And so when that self doubt comes in and it's mixed with maybe the idea that the doubt will come from someone else, that's going to lead you to mask. That's going to lead a lot of people to do that. But masking is only good for the short term. It's only going to worsen those feelings and those emotions you have about yourself, and you're never going to resolve those things. I wanted to take a little bit of time at the end of episode 50 to reflect a little bit on how the podcast has kind of gone through the first 50 episodes. I'm a little less than a year. I'm like a few months from a year of doing the podcast. I guess like quite a few months. I've tried to most of the time about like two podcasts every week, taking a couple breaks in between and stuff like that, and maybe sometimes doing only one a week. At first I had a little bit more of like I was trying to do it like every couple of days type thing, and that became a little bit too much for sure. But eventually kind of setting I feel like it was right around like after like Christmas type thing where I felt like I was setting into that like two times a week, I was switching it from like Monday to Thursday and then Tuesday, Friday. But now I've just done like Tuesday, Fridays, and I probably will continue to do that. But I'm very happy, I think, of what I've done so far, through the first 50 episodes. I never really, at first it was hard to like the whole thing. I was struggling with starting the podcast at first, and the whole thing was that I didn't know how I wanted it to be like laid out or whatever. I didn't know like necessarily like all the topics I wanted to talk about. I had some ideas. I always wanted to talk about like mental health topics. It's something very important to me, and but I wanted to have fun with things, right? And keep it very random. Originally the Odd Thoughts podcast was going to be called the One Mic podcast because I had one mic. But I don't know. I don't know why I changed that. I forget why I changed that. But the Odd Thoughts podcast started seeming a little bit better. It kind of was like it pulled more of what I wanted things to be. The odd thoughts, literally the random everyday odd thoughts. That's what we like to talk about, right? Just have conversations about relatable topics, whatever comes to mind. And so, first, I think I kind of wasn't really honing into that, right? I was really, I'm still someone who tries to like outline every episode, but eventually, I was less like, I was less holding on to trying to be perfect in the way of like saying everything I wanted. And I used to get kind of upset when I felt like I was messing up, and I used to like restart topics over and over and over and over and over again. But I kind of eventually came to the acceptance that I'm not going to be able to perfectly talk about everything. And the whole idea is that I'm not like sitting here and I'm not trying to tell you every single little bit of information about every single little thing to the T. The whole idea is that I want to try to open up conversation. When I talk about certain topics, I want people to expand it on their own. Maybe there's something I left out that you feel like should have been included, right? You kind of talk along with me and, maybe even research the stuff on your own. That's the whole point that I wanted to do with the podcast. I just like, and that was the thing for myself too with the podcast, right? Is that I just wanted something that made me feel a little bit more confident to put myself out there, to put my voice out there, and also made me feel better about like my mental health. I so many times I've told myself like you need to verbalize things, man. You need to like let things out. You need to say things, and your inner head, your inner voice is only going to do so much, and it doesn't sound like yourself sometimes. And that's what sucks. And so it's weird sometimes talking about yourself in a room, and I don't mind it necessarily. It's always helped me out, but there became a thing that maybe I could talk on a microphone and reach out to a couple people, one person, five people, 10 people, who the fuck cares? Sorry for my language. Just reach out to a couple people that can feel the same way. And it was never meant to necessarily, I would love for this podcast to be huge, but I mean like I'm not in the formula of what podcasts are, right? This is very much so like the anti-podcast in a way. It's not, I don't have the visual aspect. I don't have another person with me. It's not super random in some aspects. Some things it is like some topics I really research, but some topics I just talk. You know what I'm saying? But I'm doing very much so the things that I'm not doing the things that podcasters do. I'm doing the opposite of that stuff. Everything's a little more planned out, and I'm just on a microphone. I don't have a co-host, and so it's not the traditional podcast in a way. I'm not saying it's different in a better sense or different in a unique sense, but I kind of, I didn't do it as everybody else was doing it maybe, or as some of the more famous ones. I know that if I wanted to grow the podcast, I would need to probably put myself up on a camera. Like I probably will need to show myself at some time. That's a inevitable, it feels like, you know what I'm saying? Or maybe I will. And that's the whole thing with this break that I'm gonna take after this episode. I'm gonna take I don't know, a short break. I just like I like the things I do now 100%. Like I like having the four topics. It kind of at first it was like one topic per episode, and then I think I went to 3, and then 4 just felt right. It felt like, I always wanted to keep episodes under an hour, but then eventually, like, it's impossible with 4 topics. It feels like that, like, this episode will run over an hour. I forget how, I'm not done with the topic yet, so I don't know. But it's one of those things where, I eventually you start to get a little bit better in because I started to outline a little bit easier, and and kind of outline in like the language that I want to talk in, and understanding how I actually like to speak. And then it made it like a lot easier, keeping things like very formulated in that way. But it was stressful to kind of do the research, in some stressful to a point. It's not hard work. It's like going on the computer and looking up stuff, and like looking at a couple articles, or really always first asking questions myself, or trying to ask questions myself as best as possible. There's some things that are so foreign to me that I have no idea about and I've never thought about. So those are some of the funner topics I feel like I've talked about, or like the things that I learned and I shared with you type things. But yeah, very happy with the first 50 episodes. There are ways I probably could, like I said, advertise myself a little bit better, and I could be on social media more and yada yada, but nonetheless happy with how things have gone. I think like I can't, some of my favorite topics I don't really know. Like I really liked around like Halloween, and then around Christmas I did more like holiday themed stuff, which I always was kind of fun. It's I appreciate kind of the change I took. At first, like I switched rooms in the house I live in. So like, in that time period I used to sit in a little ass closet in like the one room I sat in. It was uncomfortable and hot. I probably have made plenty of comments through those first early episodes. But then eventually I moved rooms a few months ago. And like I now I just sit on the sit on the edge of my bed, and I'm literally talking into a microphone while looking at like the spikes on my like audio like and stuff like that. That's where we've come to, I think I've become a little more comfortable too. I think it was always like this thing at first where like I would start a podcast, and I used to now I just start with like the topics. I literally, like, how I record is I start talking about the topics. I do my four topics. I do the outro, and then I do the intro. And so then like with the intro I just can cut it and put it at the beginning type thing. So it makes it really easy. Before I used to struggle so much and think that like I needed to have that energy, right? And I was struggling to have the energy to like have the intro and like do it properly. And but eventually when I like switched that, and I like just said like, well, I'll just start talking about the topics first, and then I'll do my outro, because it still feeds into like that canonical, or like the whatever linear time, whatever. And then I could do the intro at the end, and I could literally just cut it, and I just put it at the beginning. Editing magic, wow. But it became so much easier, I think, when I started doing it that way. Because like the topics were the easy part. I feel like always it was like I just like it was like I literally struggled so hard with the intro. Like I used to feel so stupid doing it, and then like it would make me get so angry, and I'd just be so pissed at myself. And then like I would start a topic, and the intro wouldn't sound right, and like I would like fumble too much. Now I kind of accept that. I mean, how often do I like I'm talking about a topic and I stop in the middle of the topic and I'm like, where the hell was I? Like, I'm so confused on what I wrote. Like, there's a naturalness I need to have with podcasting, right? It's like you don't want to just hear a robotic voice, or you don't want to hear just someone talking at you all the time. So, I want to have that certain like eloquence, and that certain like, that certain ability to speak properly and thoroughly think through things, but also have a personality behind things, and laugh at myself a little bit when I mess up, and also like take those things and interpret it on my own, right? That's a big thing, is I often reiterate what I just said type thing. So that's a thing. Whatever. Yada yada. But I used to it's like I'm a little more comfortable now. I still get a little embarrassed at like in my house recording, like people can hear me type thing, but I mean, like I'm literally talking to a microphone into a for a podcast that's going to be heard by others. So why would I be okay with people hearing in my own? I'm so weird like that. I'm just so dumb. Always thinking that way. But yeah, like I said, I'm gonna take a break. That's just a simple thing with it. And I've enjoyed all the episodes, and I don't want to stop necessarily. I just don't want to come back with the exact same thing. I don't know, man. Try to do a video aspect. I don't have a camera, but I have a phone. It's not going to be great quality video, but maybe that feels a certain way. And maybe like, instead of just doing like a whole podcast, like I've talked about like just taking each topic and just kind of doing it in its own video, each one doing it by itself type thing. And maybe like that's just a better way to do it, especially with like mental health topics. Is like, if I put a couple of them together in like an episode, maybe that people don't want to listen to it because it's not what they want or da 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 da. But maybe in the sense of like individual videos, people can kind of scroll through and, constantly like look through each one and see like what they actually want to like listen to or whatever. Change it from the Odd Thoughts podcast to like the Odd Thoughts journal type thing. I don't know. That's something I'm thinking about too, but I mainly want to take the break because I want to try to find out what else I'm going to do. Podcasting isn't going to take me to the Holy Land anyway or whatever. Like, it's not going to be the thing that I think I'm going to hold my hat on. I would love for it to grow and become something bigger, but it's kind of something that like I feel like sometimes podcasts are served best when it's done by someone who's already known in a way. Like we all like sometimes we like to see our favorite celebrities have a podcast or some people that we watch on YouTube or on TikTok have their own podcast or something like that. So maybe like I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure that out. And that's why I'm taking a break, but also like I'd like to come back with like some guests like my little sister or my older sister or my dad or whoever and maybe think of like less topics. Like going back to 3 is probably what I would do and bringing back maybe a little bit of a longer intro so that I can really like cuz I like that whole like spewing kind of word vomit at the beginning and then getting into actual topics. And try to throw in current events and actual real world stuff. Like got to be a little more comfortable with that. So, but that's the whole thing is I've always been timid about talking about that stuff because if I talk about something serious and I talk about something very much so like that, I want to put my face on, out there so that people know it's me saying it and I'm not hiding behind something and I'm not hiding behind some sort of facade or whatever. I want people to see me when I say something type thing and they can hold me accountable. They know the face that said it or whatever. Whatever, like I'm important or whatever. Fuck. Sorry, excuse my language. But yeah, just a little bit of like a podcast retrospective, man, and I appreciate everybody who's listened and I don't care, like, if it's 1, I don't care if it's 5, I don't care if it's 50, like, I've had a couple good episodes that have been listened to by a few people. It doesn't matter. What matters is that if someone does come across the podcast in whatever sense that is, then maybe they want to listen. Maybe there's a topic that they came across on that specific episode that really hits home for them. I think that's something that we need to do a lot more of is this selflessness in a way where the things that you do and the things that you produce aren't going to be, you know, people are maybe going to pay attention to it and who cares what you say? It's maybe not that important, but you do have to do justice to say the best things possible and think through the things that you do. And that's something that I take very seriously with the podcast is I want to be thorough and I want to be able to talk about things that everybody does want to hear even if they don't want to hear it type thing. But more to come. There will be more to come. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know how long it'll be. I'm going to take a break. There will be more episodes to come. So stay tuned for the future of the Odd Thoughts podcast. Alrighty, friends. That's really all I have to say about that. Episode 50 done. I appreciate everybody for listening to the podcast as always. If you want to listen to this episode or any of my past episodes or any future episodes, I always make sure to upload on YouTube and Spotify under the Odd Thoughts podcast. If you find anything I say enjoyable or relatable in any way, then I always appreciate a little support. You can, subscribe to the podcast on YouTube and Spotify. You could also follow me on a few different social medias. I have Instagram. I also have Facebook, and then I'm also on Twitter. I'll make sure to link those all in the video description below, as well as like any channel descriptions, any bios in general. But yeah, nonetheless, you know, episode 50 finally done. It's a pretty big milestone. It kind of that like 50 episodes is a lot. I always appreciate the chance to get on the microphone, and I literally will say that for here till the very end of the podcast whenever I decide it's over. Like I said, I'm gonna take a little bit of a break though. There's plenty of episodes for people to ingest on in the meantime, and I'm only going to come back with something better, whether it's another, rendition of the podcast, or maybe I do the same thing. I don't know. I'm going to think. Or I do some sort of other creative outlet or there's some sort of other content. Stay tuned in though. But nonetheless, I love y'all. Don't forget to tell someone else you love them as well. Make sure to show up for yourselves every single day and be excellent to each other.
You are watching a